Disclaimer: substances such as ayahuasca, bufo alvarius, psilocybin, and LSD can produce serious and extremely intense visual and auditory hallucinations. This video is not to encourage the use of psychedelic substances. This video is for educational purposes only. This is not professional medical or psychological advice. Hey, welcome to Psychotropic Release. On this first official episode, I thought it would be appropriate to discuss exactly how psychedelics are revolutionizing the mental health field. I feel that in order to get an understanding of why psychedelics are the future for mental health treatment, we need to take a look at modern mainstream clinical psychology and psychiatry. In order to fully grasp where the mental health field is heading, it would be helpful to understand the history of mental health treatment up until this point, as well as understand how the most common and mainstream form of treatment for depression and anxiety, SSRIs, have come into play. I also want to add that this video is looking at mental health in the specific lens of depression and anxiety. While psychedelics have the ability to treat a range of psychological issues, my primary focus is on depression and anxiety. Disclaimer: I am not discouraging the practice of talk therapy and pharmaceutical medication. I am aware that these two treatments may be essential for many people, and I would never discourage anyone from seeking professional help. It's always beneficial to talk to a professional if you are struggling. It's abundantly clear that we are currently experiencing a mental health crisis. Mental health issues such as depression and anxiety have grown exponentially in the last 2 decades. With the pandemic not too far behind us, people are experiencing mental health issues now more than ever. Reports of depression and anxiety have skyrocketed. Mental Health America states that 1 in 5 adults will receive a diagnosable mental health condition in any given year. That's 46% of Americans that will meet the criteria for a diagnosable disorder in their lifetime. And half of these people will be considered to have a mental health disorder by age 14. 21 million adults suffer from depression, 42 million adults suffer from anxiety disorder, and 19 million with a substance abuse disorder in the United States alone. So, what are the go-to mainstream solutions when one is struggling? In the United States, the default treatment is talk therapy combined with medication. And as someone who's been more or less in therapy for 10 years, I have conflicting beliefs when it comes to talk therapy's effectiveness. While it may be beneficial for day-to-day issues such as life changes or relationship issues, overall, I believe talk therapy can produce less than desirable outcomes for those dealing with significant and debilitating mental illness. I will always encourage those struggling to reach out to a professional. However, I do not think it's a ridiculous statement to say that talk therapy is faulty. First off, talk therapy has evolved very minimally over the last few decades. While coping skills such as CBT and DBT have evolved, talk therapy practices overall have remained stagnant. Talk therapy doesn't acknowledge or even address a surmounting evidence that trauma and emotions are stored at a cellular level in the body. That's right, if you've ever read The Body Keeps the Score, you already know that trauma is literally stored physically in the body. Therefore, talking about traumatic events usually doesn't simply eradicate symptoms that derive from trauma. It may help you cope with symptoms, but it won't get to the root cause or origin of the issue in the first place. Also, therapeutic experience depends on the therapist, their skill level, education, background, and ability to build a strong rapport. I am currently in therapy now, and while I absolutely love my therapist, I have had less than desirable experiences with other therapists, psychologists, and psychiatrists that have made me really question how helpful professionals can be during times of crisis. Now, the rise of the use of pharmaceutical medication has also skyrocketed. According to the American Psychological Association, by 2002, only 7.7% of people were on antidepressants compared to 2017 when 12.7% of people were taking antidepressants. And this number only continues to increase. This would be okay if SSRIs seem to be helpful, but instead we continue to see those struggling with mental health receive little to no relief. At alarming rates, people tend to be getting worse, not better. Okay, so in order to understand how psychedelics are likely to create breakthroughs in the mental health field, it would be helpful to understand mainstream mental health treatment approaches and the history behind pharmaceutical drugs versus psychedelics. Specifically, how the war on drugs essentially halted the research and clinical development for psychedelics and only paved a clearer pathway for pharmaceutical drugs like SSRIs. So let's take a little journey back to the 1950s and 60s, where thousands of patients were legally using LSD, psilocybin, and mescaline for therapeutic purposes. Around this time, more than 1,000 research papers were being written about LSD and psilocybin and other psychedelic drugs. 40,000 subjects were given these mind-expanding agents, and progress was being made to further understand how these substances might help people suffering from depression and alcoholism. Many studies concluded that when treating depression, addiction, and emotional trauma, LSD proved to be more effective where other drugs and therapy were not. By 1960, efforts for LSD to be studied more deeply was implemented. Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, the company in which LSD was created, sent psychedelics, specifically psilocybin, to Timothy Leary, a professor and researcher at Harvard University in Boston. Between 1960 and 1962, Timothy Leary, alongside Richard Alpert, ran the Harvard Psilocybin Project, where Leary believed psilocybin could be the solution for the emotional problems of Western man. Specifically, they were interested to see if different means of administration led to different psychedelic experiences. Unfortunately, although Leary's findings with psilocybin were promising, the lack of ethics in the study left the citizens of the United States with more of a negative perception of psychedelics than hopeful. Leary's psilocybin project quickly ended, and Leary was fired when people found out he was misusing the substance and allegedly pressured students to ingest the psychedelic substance. Unfortunately, in the end, Timothy Leary added more to the counterculture mentality of psychedelics, rather than adding to the mindset that psychedelics should be a serious topic to further investigate. By 1963, psychedelic drug research became significantly more difficult. Pharmaceutical research became much more strict, and psychedelic drugs were no exception. Sandoz ceased providing psychedelic drugs for research, and non-medical use was prohibited by 1970. Around this time, LSD and other psychedelics were beginning to be more and more linked with counterculture, such as the anti-war movement and the rise of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Cue the infamous music festival Woodstock. Not only was psychedelics for research prohibited, the use of all psychedelic drugs became illegal. This consequently led to the war on drugs when Richard Nixon declared that drug abuse was public enemy number one on June 18, 1971, naming Timothy Leary the most dangerous man in America. The war on drugs aimed at reducing the illegal drug trade in the United States by discouraging the production, distribution, and consumption of psychoactive drugs. The war on drugs essentially laid the foundation for Big Pharma to heavily push pharmaceutical drugs more than ever, with psychedelics illegal both recreationally and for research purposes. Big Pharma was able to monopolize medication for mental health treatment. It's no surprise that by 2023, Big Pharma will make an astounding $16 billion a year on antidepressants alone. Some may think it's a coincidence, but I think it's quite interesting that when the war on drugs began, research encouraging SSRIs into the pharmaceutical market became the central focus of research and inevitably became the most popular mean of treatment. Or, if you're on the same similar spiritual wavelength as me, you know it's because the US government doesn't want us to know we can heal ourselves. Simultaneously, as the war on drugs was announced, evidence of the role of neurotransmitters, especially serotonin, was gathering. By 1987, Prozac was approved by the FDA and was available for public use the following year. 8 years later, in 1995, Prozac had already made a profit of $2 billion worldwide. And again, antidepressants make up $16 billion in sales alone. Now, as I've stated previously, I personally find it interesting that around the same time psychedelics became illegal, pharmaceutical companies placed a heavy emphasis on researching and marketing SSRIs. And while the use of SSRIs have peaked within recent years, no one talks about how antidepressants have barely improved or evolved. In fact, by the mid-2000s, the major pharmaceutical companies started disinvesting in this area, and in 2010, AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Merck, and Sanofi all announced they had stopped looking for new and approved antidepressants altogether. And can you guess what started to happen? Yeah, that's right. Psychedelics came right back into the picture, with research on psychedelics starting right back up again. Now, I think in order to accurately paint a picture of how promising psychedelics are in mental health treatment, we need to look at the efficacy of both SSRIs and psychedelics. Again, if you're watching this and pharmaceutical medication has been a lifesaver for you, that's great. However, I believe there's an astounding number of people who don't benefit from SSRIs or may actually get worse, which is not talked about enough. Back in the mid-90s, a man by the name of Irvine Kirsch and his colleagues did an independent investigation of the effectiveness of SSRIs. They looked at trial results from the FDA for 6 antidepressants, and they concluded that these studies had been systematically manipulated to further market antidepressants. And both unpublished and published trials had data showing that the changes in mood in the participants were no different than taking a placebo. There's been many studies comparing the results of taking an SSRI and taking a placebo. Here's a meta-analysis comparing the efficacy of 21 antidepressant drugs that were used to treat adults with major depressive disorder. Overall, this meta-analysis found that SSRIs have a modest benefit over a placebo. Not only are SSRIs barely more effective than a placebo, many people could experience what is called a flatline effect, where the drug may have been helpful at one time, but the individual grows accustomed to the drug to the point where it is no longer effective. So while you may reap the benefits in the first few months or years, you essentially go back to square one. It's not totally uncommon for antidepressants to simply stop working over time in some people. Furthermore, 30% of adults with major depressive disorder are also treatment resistant. They may try a number of different medications and treatments to no avail, and this is where psychedelics come back into play. Those who suffer from treatment-resistant depression, not responding to traditional antidepressants, do respond to psilocybin, ketamine, LSD, and MDMA, and more. In fact, the efficacy rates for psychedelics is incredible. Many different psychedelics are being used to treat anxiety, depression, PTSD, and more. Just to give you an idea, here are some examples. A study by Johnson and other researchers reported that only 2 doses of psilocybin alongside supportive psychotherapy significantly reduced depressive symptoms among adults with major depressive disorder. Those who took a high dose of psilocybin had improvement in their symptoms and quality of life. Even after 6 months, participants showed clinically significant decreases in anxiety and depression. A study in 2018 found that ketamine significantly reduced depressive symptoms and suicidal behaviors within 24 hours. In a study with 90 participants, researchers found that 67% of people treated with MDMA-assisted therapy no longer met the diagnostic criteria for PTSD 18 weeks after treatment. And these are just a few examples of the amazing results psychedelics are producing to treat mental health issues. If that wasn't enough to question SSRIs, let's not forget SSRIs lack the ability to address trauma and unprocessed emotions, which dysregulate our nervous systems, leading to mental health issues. More and more evidence shows that trauma and emotions essentially get stored physically in the body, creating many of the root causes of physical and mental illness. So, how do SSRIs affect the brain, and how is this different from psychedelics affecting the brain? SSRIs, also known as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, only affect the neurotransmitters in the brain. SSRIs do not have the ability to target, as you may say, distinct brain areas or parts. At the most basic level, SSRIs increase the levels of serotonin in the brain by blocking the reabsorption of serotonin into a neuron, which allows for the effects of serotonin to last longer. This goes back to the chemical imbalance theory, the belief that the imbalance of neurotransmitters, primarily serotonin, is the cause of depression and anxiety. While chemical imbalance in the brain may be related to depression and anxiety, correlation does not equal causation. And it is unclear whether depression is a result of a chemical imbalance or depression causes the chemical imbalance. Overall, the chemical imbalance theory for depression grossly oversimplifies the causes of depression. This theory lays the foundation for the narrative that depression can be simply fixed by balancing the chemical imbalance, creating the perfect transition to market SSRIs. I plan to do a whole other video talking about the chemical imbalance theory because I could just go on and on. But overall, SSRIs are not reliable when it comes to treating depression. Many people experience horrible side effects with the possibility of making the depression even worse. Many people who take SSRIs build a tolerance to their medication or stop seeing improvements after some use. Not to mention, the ability to get physically dependent on SSRIs is highly likely, and stopping these medications abruptly can be very dangerous. If that wasn't enough to question SSRIs, let's not forget that SSRIs lack the ability to address trauma and unprocessed emotions, which dysregulate our nervous systems, leading to mental health issues. More and more evidence shows that trauma and emotions essentially get stored physically in the body, creating many of the root causes of physical and mental illness. So, if SSRIs only affect neurotransmitters, how are psychedelics any different? To be very clear, we aren't entirely sure how psychedelics work. However, we are coming to understand that they affect numerous parts of the brain and encourage neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. Overall, psychedelics directly affect specific brain regions and promote connectivity between these regions, unlike SSRIs. Why does this matter? Well, it allows for people to more easily create different thought processes and gain a different perspective of the reality. Instead of getting anchored down with depressive, ruminating thoughts that, for lack of a better word, encourage depressive thinking. The first thing is many psychedelics are serotonergic psychedelics, meaning they directly affect serotonin receptors similarly to SSRIs. You may not know this, but psilocybin, DMT, LSD have very similar molecular structures to serotonin. Therefore, many psychedelics, like ayahuasca, affect the 5-HT2A receptors, which are plentiful in the brain networks that become overactive in depression. Some scientists believe that psychedelics briefly disrupt these connections, giving them a chance to reform in new ways. While this is interesting, I believe the most groundbreaking theory on why psychedelics are so incredibly helpful is because they impact the default mode network in our brains. So what is the default mode network? The default mode network consists of numerous brain regions. It's considered to be the most recent part of the brain in terms of evolution and is involved with older functions of the brain that are involved with memory and emotion. Essentially, the default mode network, or DMN, gets activated when the brain is in automatic mode. This is when your mind is wandering and not focused on any goal-oriented activities. This may be daydreaming, self-reflection, thinking of the past and the future, worrying and rumination. Give me a sec, I'll get back to this. It's important to note that some theorize that the default mode network is what we call the ego, specifically how we view ourselves, our identities, and how we relate to past feelings and experiences. Some think this is where self-talk takes place, which has the ability to become overly negative and self-critical. Do you see how this could be related to anxiety and depression? Well, it is. Research has found that the DMN is more active and connected in the brains of people who experience depression. People who tend to spend a lot of time thinking about what happened in the past and what may happen in the future, mostly with feelings of anxiety and worry. In fact, the stronger the connectivity in the DMN, the higher the rumination scores there were with people who were depressed. The stronger the DMN connection, the more ruminating. If you have depression, then you most likely know what ruminating is and how horrible it is to experience. But for those who are lucky enough not to experience rumination, rumination is a constant dwelling of negative thoughts and beliefs. These negative thoughts tend to be extremely repetitive and may sound like I'm not good enough, I hate myself, I'm a failure. People with depression are more likely to ruminate about feelings of grief, anger, sadness, shame, and guilt. The more dominant the DMN is in your brain, the more likely you will experience maladaptive ruminations. The DMN is seen to be hierarchical, meaning that when the default mode network is running, it tends to take center stage with other brain functions operating behind it. So you may think of the DMN as being the lead singer, center stage, spotlight and all, where other brain networks are the band. Sure, you need the band to carry the performance of the singer, but your primary focus is on the singer. So why is this so important? In theory, psychedelics quiet the DMN by decreasing its activity. While the DMN is quieted, other brain regions are able to become heightened. When in the background, brain regions come to the forefront and are able to make new connections with each other. With new neural pathways, an individual will have a much easier time creating new thought patterns that they were not able to before. While people with depression experience cognitive rigidity, getting stuck in repetitive thought cycles and rigid patterns of thinking, psychedelics are able to abolish this by creating cognitive flexibility. Matthew Brown has given an analogy for how psychedelics are able to reset the DMN. If you do the same thing repeatedly, it is like you're walking down the same path all the time. Naturally, that path becomes very well worn and easy to walk down. However, you realize that maybe there's another path that might be more advantageous for you, and you want to try to walk down that path. Psychedelics mow the lawn so that it doesn't seem that weeds are quite so high, and you could walk down that new path a little bit more easily. This is further proven by a study which focused on how psilocybin is able to create a more global brain network, one that works in sync and rather than a brain that compartmentalizes and lacks proper communication between structures. Researchers at King's College and Imperial College in London looked at how psilocybin compared to the traditional antidepressant Lexapro would affect those with depression. The researcher, Richard Dawes, also supports this concept of cognitive rigidity. Dawes explains there's a tendency for people with severe depression to get stuck in a rut and to suffer from repetitive negative thinking where they get stuck in a cycle or rigid patterns of thinking. In order to evaluate the relationship between different systems in the brain, Dawes sought to evaluate how segregated the different brain systems were in the participants. Researchers evaluated brain activity before receiving a dose of either psilocybin or the SSRI, and then again after receiving the final dose. Those who received the SSRI reported mild improvement in their symptoms, but did not have any major changes in neural networks within their brain. However, the participants who received psilocybin reported significant relief of their depressive symptoms far beyond those who took the antidepressant. Not only that, but the researchers also saw significant changes in their brain scans. The second scan showed much more activity and more connections across many different areas of the brain, overall creating significant network integration. Here's a visual depiction of this concept, aka here's your brain and this is your brain on psilocybin. Dawes says that the participants who had the most dramatic changes, hence the more network integration, also had the most relief from their symptoms. The best visualization for this is that Dawes saw the depressed brain as a topographical landscape. The more severe the depression, the deeper the valleys, and aka the more segregated the networks. But as you can see in this nice picture, psilocybin evens it all out. Now, the topic of ego deaths can be a whole other video, multiple videos really, but I think the concept of ego dissolution is important to talk about and include in this video. Typically, it's our ego, which we talked about previously, that tends to create and harbor negative thought patterns. Unfortunately, when you're experiencing episodes of depression and anxiety, people tend to hyper-focus on their own thoughts and view of themselves, which makes it incredibly difficult to see the bigger picture and different perspectives. The ego tends to be able to create boundaries, disconnecting us from others and ourselves. Now, having an ego death, or what is also called ego dissolution, can force a person to see things on a macroscopic level. Not microscopic, macroscopic. Ego death in an intense way reminds you that you are indeed interconnected with the world and the universe. An intense psychedelic experience can reconnect you to yourself as well as higher power / the universe. Final thoughts I have about this subject. I mentioned that SSRIs lack the ability to truly resolve one's deepest wounds and traumas. While psychedelics have scientific reasonings for their healing powers, I could spend hours and many videos discussing and dissecting the spiritual power many of these medicines have, especially ayahuasca. But that's a whole other story. I know this video has a lot of information, but I think it's important to acknowledge and understand pharmaceutical drugs, such as SSRIs, as well as psychedelics. I think to be able to fully understand how psychedelics are so revolutionary, we need to understand how we got to the place we are in now and why it is not enough. If pharmaceutical drugs and talk therapy were really pulling their weight, there wouldn't be a need to research these other means of healing. And I'll just leave you with that.